Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well. We're ready to talk about Syria. We have visited about Syria quite a few times, but there's a little bit of news yesterday. In some ways, I found it a little bit entertaining, but it's also very serious, and depending on which rebel group you support, there could be some good news or bad news. But the big issue is dealing around Damascus, East Ghouta, and what I found so interesting is what was devastating was the last-ditch bombing by the anti-Assad rebels and al-Qaeda type people, because they're losing the war there, and Assad has recovered and taken back about 80% of that area, and it looks like the rebels and the al-Qaeda are losing this fight. Of course, it looks like we're probably closer to that group than we are to, we're not close to Assad at all, so we sort of cheer them on. But there was a big bombing, which was devastating in a sense. It killed a lot of people, civilians, 38 civilians, children, and seems like our government hasn't expressed any real concern about the loss of life. Sometimes, they get hysterical if they think one individual may have been gassed when they have no evidence. But all of a sudden now, this is ignored. But this is pretty important because if Assad gets total control of this doesn't mean that war's over, because there's still, the far eastern part, and there's still a lot of turmoil there. But Assad will be essentially not going away. The whole program of Assad has to go, established by Obama, doesn't look like it's working out that well. So I think that, of course, I'll mention this a little bit later on, but I found it fascinating that Assad made a visit to Syria too, because it was of high priority.
Yeah, it was. And, we've a couple of things. We said a couple of weeks ago when we talked about this, we outlined the 5 different rebel groups who were controlling Eastern Ghouta, and all of them were jihadists, all of them were in favor of Sharia law, and they were mostly backed by the U.S., some explicitly backed by the U.S. So these guys were backing there, and now that they're on the ropes, and I think you mentioned earlier that 80% of Eastern Ghouta was recovered by the Syrian government forces. So really this is, and that's why we picked this title, this is sort of the last stand of Obama's policy of supporting moderates who all turned out to be jihadists, in trying to overthrow Assad. This is kind of, as you say, they're far from one, but the recovery of this is a significant event. And the U.S. has been screaming about this for weeks and weeks, how terrible it is that that Assad is taking this area back. And of course, civilians dying is horrible, but these people had been held as human hostages as they were in eastern Aleppo.
You don't buy into the argument that the big problem is that they didn't take John McCain's advice and support the moderates. And of course, the people who have actually visited there said there are no moderates there. And that is probably the case. But the whole thing is this is the kind of mixture you get when we're involved in a no-win, undeclared, immoral war. It goes on. You can't figure out who the enemy is and when the war is over and what the purpose is. It's a typical example of what happens. But philosophically in this country, the people who work the hardest to promote this policy are the neoconservatives. They're the ones who believe that we have to remake the Middle East, and they've had influence. We're still trying to figure out how much influence do they have on this administration. They haven't gone away. Certainly there was hope even from us that the new administration would be less influenced by the neoconservatives, but it doesn't look like they've gone away. Now, I saw something the other day, an article by Max Boot, and he's a powerhouse when it comes to neoconservatives. Does he speak for the neoconservatives? He has a different position. We have thought that maybe this will just really discourage all the neocons and they'll walk away. But what do you think Boot's position is on this?
Well, Boot, of course, as all the neocons, was very gung-ho about the U.S. needs to attack Syria. This is back in 2012, I think. We've got to go in there and bomb them. We've got to set up a no-fly zone. We've got to make sure we overthrow Assad. This was his position all along. But what's happened, what's shifted, and this was a piece he did on March 8th in the Washington Post. What shifted is that post-liberation East Aleppo, looks a lot different than the neocons and the administration predicted. In fact, we have a picture of Aleppo. No, the Aleppo picture would be the third picture we have. This is the bombing. But so here's what Max Boot had to say, and this is a real shocking turn in a way, but we'll say why it's not shocking. We can just leave that up for a second. He said, "To save Syrians, let Assad win." That was the title of his piece. And here's a quote. "The way to save lives, I've sadly concluded, is to let Assad win as quickly as possible. Aleppo was a charnel house in 2016, meaning a graveyard, but now that it has fallen to Assad's forces, pictures are circulating of civilians strolling through its rebuilt park. It's terrible they have to live under Assad, but at least they're alive. Tyranny is preferable to endless and useless war."
That's a changed attitude.
That's remarkable. But I don't want to give him too much credit because he goes on to say a lot of other stupid things. But essentially what I think he's doing, I hate to say it this way, a rat is fleeing the sinking ship. He doesn't want to be the last neocon. As happened in Iraq, remember how they were ridiculed for holding out that this was the right war. He doesn't want to be that guy when it comes to Syria.
Now he mentions people strolling and in the park and certainly not looking for Assad to shoot at them. What I found interesting and a strong message is Assad, just yesterday or the day before yesterday, he decided, well, I'm going to go and inspect this place that's been in turmoil for 7 years, more or less to say, things have settled down, we're winning this war, and I'm going to make a presence. But did he have tanks and people protect him? He gets in a Honda, and he drives the car, and he has his arm out to him, probably waving to people, and nobody's shooting at him. And I keep thinking, wonder if our president, any president we've had for the last 30 years, could he get in his private car and drive out the White House and drive up and down the slums of Washington, D.C., or maybe take his Honda and drive through the slums of Detroit or Chicago or even the homeless areas of Los Angeles or whatever? I mean, it would be way too dangerous. But here it is, described that Assad is willing to do this to make a point. And the other big point is the cities that have been relieved from the oppression of the rebels, the normal population have moved back quickly to those areas, and obviously he's making that point. So it's so different than what you hear about and think about Assad. And he has his problems, but I'll tell you what, the reporters and the propagandists have a problem too, much greater than his.
And speaking of propagandists, here's Heather Nauert, the State Department spokesperson. Here's what she said just a month ago. "The horrors of East Aleppo are being repeated in East Ghouta, with the ongoing slaughter of trapped civilians and woefully inadequate access for humanitarian actions." She's saying completely the opposite of what happened. We saw the pictures of the park in Aleppo. It didn't happen that way. It was a siege, and civilians did die, as they died in Mosul when we bombed it, and Raqqa when we bombed it. It's all unfortunate. But the horrors of the horror was that they were being occupied by Al Qaeda, which is no longer there. So she just completely turned it on its head. And you know what's funny? We're not seeing a lot from the State Department now about East Ghouta, now that the Syrian army opened a corridor and 40,000, at least I think at last count, 40,000 civilians fled under protection into government-controlled territories. Why would they do that if the government was about to kill them?
Yes, in this thing about Boot's position of backing off, and save themselves for another day, this whole thing of this phone call that Assad made, or Trump made to the king of Saudi Arabia. He says, hey, how about King Solomon? How about giving us about $4 billion? And then you go in and take care, and we can use that money to rebuild. It like Trump wants to move out, but the payment will come from the Saudis because they have an interest, and they probably have to neutralize what they think is happening with Iran being influenced there. And I kept thinking, this is amazing that we're in the position of brokering something like that. I can't believe that would happen, but you can see on the surface why Trump might think, well, this might be a good deal. You know, it's a good deal for America. We back off, we get some money, we pay somebody else to do the bidding, and we satisfy the Saudis, and we continue to fight with the Iranians.
Yeah, it is. It's it's a fascinating call. The Washington Post reported on this call. It was in December, and if you want to look at it in a bright side, I think it shows that his instincts might be good, because the whole idea was that if we get this money from the Saudis, reconstruct, the guarantee we make the Saudis is we won't let Assad back in eastern Syria. But he said this might help us hasten our retreat, our departure from Syria. So if in his mind he's thinking, how do I get us out of there quicker, and he makes this thing that he thinks is a deal, there's actually something good in that. You know, his instinct is right.
But I can see some downsides to it, because still there are some Syrians who think Syria ought to be Syria.
Yeah.
And there will be people who will think that the Saudis and their arrangement up there is against the interests of Russia and Syria, as well as Iran. So theoretically, that's how most of these things work. Theoretically, it's supposed to work like this, but these intentions don't always work out that way, but maybe it's a lot better than saying, well, let's have a demonstration. We now have a bigger bomb than we dropped on Afghanistan. We need to test it and drop in that. That wouldn't make any sense. But at least this is a different approach. But sometimes I think things like this this seems so bizarre, and it could only happen when you have a policy which is so disjointed that something like this could be a serious proposal.
See, instead of calling King Solomon on how to get our troops out, he should have called you, because you would have said, just go home.
Get out there.
Simple. You don't need the $40 billion or $4 billion from the Saudis.
Right.
Make it simpler. But a couple of other things. You know, we talked about the marketplace bombing, and this was horrific yesterday. And this is something that's troubling, because we hear over and over the U.S. is ready to attack Syria. If you dare use gas again, we're going to hit you, we're going to hit you, we're going to hit you. And even when there is no evidence of gas, we blame them for using it. Mattis, early last month, the Secretary of Defense, he made a bizarre and startling claim. He said, I don't have the evidence. What I'm saying, this is about Syrian government using gas. I don't have the evidence. What I am saying is that the other groups on the ground, NGOs, fighters on the ground, have said that sarin has been used. So we're looking for the evidence. So here's Mattis saying we have no idea. When he talks about NGOs, he's probably talking about the White Helmets. We've talked about them on this show, founded by a British intelligence officer, funded by the US and UK government. I wouldn't look at that as an objective source for this information. So he's saying we don't know. But when we do have something, we've seen it a couple times, and it's horrific and it's hard to look at, but that's the marketplace yesterday where there was an attack. And people were killed. For the imaginary gas attacks, Nikki Haley blamed the Russians and Syrians. For a real attack, what was Nikki Haley? Was she condemning this attack on the marketplace? What was she doing yesterday? Well, she only had a couple tweets yesterday. I think she was busy. But here's one of her tweets. I'm spending my day of happiness on the couch with a blanket, tea, and a book. So whenever there's the imaginary gas attack that Assad is doing, she's out there tweeting until her fingers are bleeding. But when there's a real attack that we have pictures of, she's sitting on her couch drinking tea.
And they want the moral high ground. And sometimes with the media's help, they get the moral high ground because they express the concern for the children. But this has been going on for a long time as a result of our foreign policy, all the way back to the 90s, bombing Iraq and how many children were killed and the destruction of the infrastructure. So it's on and on, but it's always we care about the children, and it's always the enemy that does it. It's never the fact that we're there, and it's never the fact that it's our weapons that happen to be killing these people and involving so many civilians.
Absolutely. And, I would just take this from what we're saying today to once again remind everyone, this is what we're talking about, non-interventionism. How could we have avoided this? We're not Max Boot. We don't say war, 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 then we realize it's a disaster, say, well, let's change our mind. We say don't go in at all. What is the right foreign policy for the United States? Non-interventionism. That's why we're having a conference next month with our friends at the Future of Freedom Foundation. We're going to outline what it looks like, what the policy should look like. So go to our website. Dr. Paul, tickets are selling fast because they're also very inexpensive. We want a lot of people. I was surprised at how many have been snapped up already. Get your ticket. Join us in South Carolina. More information on it is at our website that you see there on the screen.
Yes, and I want to say that it's been very encouraging because the response has been very favorable. People can get into the program for $5, but we've suggested that, of course, we do have bills to pay, and we've had some extra donations. This has been very, very helpful. To me, this is a sign that even though we struggle to have a significant change in our policy, I think there is a shift. I think the instincts of the people are always for peace and no war, and that they are on our side. It's just a matter of getting that information. But I think we're making inroads because the people are sick and tired of it, and they know the money's running out and these budgets can't last forever. And they also know that they can't trust what the government is saying. And this is the reason why I think that we are getting a more positive support for our programs and for our conferences. I wished we could do a lot more, but we will do the best we can, and we do reach a lot of people every day. And the message of non-interventionism is a pro-American message. It's what the founders advocated. It's a position of peace, and that leads to prosperity. How can we lose? I've often wondered to myself, how do we lose on this when we take a moral principle of personal liberty to do what you want with your life as long as you don't hurt anybody, a non-interventionist foreign policy and civil liberties, and prosperity, because we sincerely believe that is the consequence, that prosperity comes with the liberty. I figured, why do we lose these debates? How can it be? And I think the one thing is there's been a lot of people over the last century become dependent on government and think that everything comes from the government. But now that the evidence is loud and clear that the government is failing, it's failing on its social programs, its welfare programs, and all these things, believe me, they're going to have to look elsewhere. What we have to make sure is they don't say, well, that's true, but we just need more money from the government. We got to show them the government has nothing except what they take from somebody else. And that is why a position of peace and prosperity is the one we endorse, and we hope you will join us. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.